Hi, and welcome to Visual Design and Online Learning. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the general overview of using visual design in online learning contexts. What we're going to focus on here is through the use of several challenge questions. So, specifically, we're going to look what is the difference between visual design and visual literacy. There are some specific differences, and we need to become aware of those in terms of how they influence the way that we approach designing visual materials for online courses. We're also going to look at the role of visual design in online learning. So specifically, what role does it play in how learners interact with our content, and what role does it play in how we go about creating visual content for online learning? Thirdly, we're going to look at some common visual design mistakes and how they are made, and hopefully ways that we can go about avoiding making those mistakes in online learning contexts. And then finally, we're going to discuss how to critique and learn from visual design materials in online courses. So if you have access to a lot of visual materials when you begin designing and creating online courses, we're going to look at developing that critical eye that would help you to discern what is going to be a good visual versus a not so effective visual for a particular online course. Before we really get into the meat of the lesson, I think it's important to look at what makes up an online course. And from my perspective, I see it as 5 general elements. The first is content design, and this is what I am referring to as when I talk about how we compile the content that we're going to be presenting to our learners, what goes in the lesson, what stays out of the lesson. Those sort of things are content-related issues. The second is instructional design. Many of us are familiar with this, so this is things such as creating learning objectives, the whole idea of what is a student going to be able to do once they finish the lesson, those sort of things. We're also looking at the general structure and sequence of online learning lessons. The third element is what I refer to as interaction design, and this would be things like how do students actually interact with the lesson through the learning management system. So for example, are we using web standards to indicate a hyperlink that students can click and go to a resource, or is it just in italics or something that is not would be considered a web standard? Those are examples of things that would be considered in an interaction design discussion. Fourth, I call this technical design, and this would be things like asking questions of is this going to be delivered on a mobile device, things like an iPad or an iPhone. So by considering the technical design of the file types and the ways that we go about creating content can have a major impact on how learners use the lessons and learn from that information. And the final element, which is obviously what brings us together in this workshop, is what I'm referring to as visual design. And visual design is really there to enhance the learning experience through the use of visual messages. And at a very simple level, we want to be able to communicate effectively through the use of visual communication and methods. And so the visual design is what we're really going to spend our focus and time on in this particular workshop. Before we get again too far into it, I want to talk a little bit about visual literacy versus visual design, because these are two terms that you're going to see a lot in the literature, and in some cases they're used in the same way, in some cases they're used differently. And so I felt it important to really define these things up front and to really focus in on what we're going to be discussing in this particular workshop. So visual literacy is what I'm referring to as the ability to evaluate, apply, or create conceptual visual representations. And so from a definition standpoint, this is really looking at how do we communicate, are we literate from using visual messages to communicate. Now, a visual design standpoint, I'm defining this as design is about solving problems. So visual design is the construction of intentional messages communicated through visual mediums aimed at solving a specific problem. So the idea that we're focusing on design is a very important and key element that we have to keep in mind as we go throughout this workshop. We're not just creating materials, we're solving problems through the use of visual messages. And so the differences between these and why we care is visual literacy is the focus on the ability to communicate, create, send, and receive using visual messages, whereas visual design, the focus is on solving communication problems through the use of visual messages. Now, oftentimes or in many cases, visual design requires good visual literacy so that we can be able to actually communicate and use this. But there is more to the design aspect than just being literate. So both visual design and visual literacy, they can be taught and developed, and that's essentially what we're doing through this particular workshop. Now, another important point I want to bring up at this particular point in the lesson is that visual design, when we start talking about this, the concept of learning styles often comes up. And the discussions like, well, I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner. And the thing that I want to kind of reframe our discussion on here is there's a tremendous debate in this particular area on the validity of learning styles at the moment. But I really want us to focus on visual design as a way of constructing visual messages so that the receiver is interpreting the message as intended. This really doesn't have anything to do with whether learning styles exist, do they not exist, and that sort of discussion. It really is how do we communicate using most effectively through the use of visual messages. And that's what we're going to really focus on in this workshop. Now, the role of visual design in online learning, I would suggest, is online learning is based on the use of multimedia. And Richard Mayer in 2009 supports this statement in saying that people learn better with words and pictures than from just words alone. And so this is the basic premise of what he refers to as the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Now, I just happen to have a lesson up here on the screen that I created at one point about CTML. But the reason why I'm showing it is not as an example, or not rather as an instructional point, but rather as an example for what we want to talk about. And so in this case, the graphics and the words and the text, they're all presented. So the learner would have to start at the top reading cognitive processing and begin to read the paragraph. And that paragraph is referring to information that is within that graphic. Now, this makes quite a challenging opportunity for learners because they're having to go back and forth visually processing this information. In contrast, if I were to present just the graphic and then if I narrate over the top of it, for example, and I would say when learners are presented with a multimedia presentation, they're often given words and pictures that they have to integrate, and this is brought in through sensory memory, through our ears and our eyes, and so forth. And so I could talk through this particular diagram all the way getting to how knowledge is worked into long-term memory. And then the learner would be able to process and focus solely visually on the graphic while processing the verbal messages through audio. And so this is a critical barrier that we have to overcome, especially in online learning, because we're dealing often with time and distance. And so we don't have a lot of extra cognitive processing to waste for our learners. And so we have to consider those things. And so visual design plays a key role in this. And it really is about how we design and how we teach in an online environment, and using visual design as a tool that we can leverage. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some common visual design mistakes, and through this, I'd really like to focus on developing that critical perspective in terms of how we look at visual materials. This is a screenshot of a blog that I follow quite frequently called the Rapid E-Learning blog. This is a post they post about every 2 to 3 days probably on this blog, and it ranges anywhere from creating e-learning content to designing instructional design, obviously, but also has a good amount of reading in it regarding visual design. And the reason why I bring this up, there's actually an article here that deals with the 5 common visual design mistakes. And I'd like to present our challenge questions kind of parallel here, that we had one dealing with the idea of common visual design mistakes and the ability to critique what we're talking about in visual design. And I'd like to really have you think about these in 2 parallel ways. So this 5 common visual design mistakes article presents 5 things that people often mess up, if you will, when they're designing visual materials. The first is not considering the impact of the visual design. So we just completely disregard the way that visual design plays into the learning process, for example. Second is a lack of unity. So we may be using all kinds of fonts, all kinds of colors that don't necessarily match, and so it creates a very jumbled and not a unity-based learning environment for people to learn in. On that, graphics don't match. So maybe we presented a photo with a piece of clip art, and there's a bit of contention there between the use of those when they're presented together. Maybe there's confusing use of contrast, so I can't really tell what's important on the screen because the contrast isn't as such that allows me to do that. And then finally, the misuse of font. So if we're talking about something seriously, we wouldn't want to use a playful font, for example. So these are all things that we have to consider and things that we have to take into account when we're critiquing how visual messages are presented in our online context. Now, I'd like to submit three more of these considerations and things that are really important to bring about and think about when you're both designing and critiquing the use of visual materials in online learning. The first is that we have a tendency to over-design. If any of us have ever recalled maybe we've done this, a student or ourselves, we get a hold of a new software tool. A PowerPoint is oftentimes the worst at this, and we find out how to do a new animation. And now from every PowerPoint that we've ever done, everything has that same animation in it. That would be an example of over-designing. So we have a tool, but yet we use it across everything that we do at that point. So we have to make sure that we use design for in purposeful situations. The second is that we're forgetting the learner. Now, the learner needs to be at the center of everything that we do. So, for example, if we know that learners are not going to react particularly well to a particular visual style, maybe we have cultural differences that colors mean things in different cultures. So we have to think about the way the visual impact is going to influence how learners use that lesson and learn from it. And finally, not acknowledging online learning is interconnected and using multiple forms of media. Now, I've seen a lot in my own practice where people will have a lot of lecture notes or something like that, and they'll put it into an online lesson and it's all text. And so but we ignore the fact that there are many multimedia resources, such as the use of video or animations or images even, that can play a big role in the learning process. And so the key questions that we have to consider are how these things interconnect and how we use them together to influence learning in positive ways. And so these are just some additional considerations that I want to submit to you, and also to kind of factor into the way that we design and critique online learning visual design materials. So in summary, we looked at several of these questions, and all these questions in terms of developing a general overview of how visual design influences online learning. And we also looked at kind of a 30,000-foot view, if you would, of how visual design works, from common mistakes to ways that we can critique visual design in our own practice. And so moving from this direction, I want to submit several next steps that you may consider to continue your learning from this lesson. The first thing I want you to consider is ways of developing your own evaluation criteria. And we're going to walk through an example of this in the module, but how do you go about creating evaluation criteria for looking at materials that are going to be helpful for you and your own particular context? And that's an important thing, is to be able to contextualize how people learn through the use of visual materials. The second is what makes online learning different from just a website or other digital materials. So, for example, if we were to have a website, let's take something like Amazon or another e-commerce website, the way that the visual design and the general design of that particular website is going to be much different than, let's say, an online course, because the goals are entirely different. And these are things that we want to think about and consider when we're going about creating those materials. And thirdly, we want to develop the skills in order to create our own visual materials, but also to use materials that are out there in the free and open domain, such as Creative Commons and things of that nature, and be able to develop a critical eye in terms of understanding that these materials that are out there may or may not be effective in our own visual context in our online courses. And so these are things that we want to consider and be able to develop from when we start developing our visual design skills and our visual design practice that we're working for in this workshop. So in this particular lesson, we really looked at the overall 30,000-foot view of visual design in online learning, and we'll pick up from here in our next modules with being able to apply some specific principles that you'll be able to use in online learning contexts.